Just one statement before I get to Mr. Fichtner, Dr. Fichtner. And that's for everybody to think about what we've heard about the dire consequences of the solar industry. I never heard those dire consequences stated when we all agreed and worked with the industry to phase out the tax credit that was going to happen on 2022 until it was extended in recent legislation. And that was a multi-year phase out. For you, Dr. Fichtner, it's interesting how we only hear about brinksmanship when it's Republicans who want to negotiate a debt ceiling. I'd note that Senator Schumer's bill lifts the debt limit through the end of 2024, maybe to maintain their leverage if we have a Republican president in 2025. So to you, is it fair to say that both parties have the debt ceiling used as leverage in negotiations?
It is fair to say that, Senator, and I would add then because of that, that's one reason why in any negotiation, whatever we do with the debt ceiling should be pushed off, as Dr. Zandy said, till after the election. And I would go one further and say it no longer does what it's intended to do. It doesn't control spending, so let's just get rid of the debt ceiling altogether.
And the chairman mentioned the what used to be called NZ White House, now White House something that I want to help him with. I would like to see us
Looking forward to it being White House Grassley, Senator.
deal with those things. I don't think you're going to have a problem for me.
Good.
Okay. To Mr. Riedel, as I mentioned, Democrats have no problem using the debt ceiling as leverage in negotiations with Republican presidents. What did Democrats demand and get in exchange for raising the debt ceiling under President Trump?
Thank you, Senator. The debt limit was raised 3 times under President Trump. Twice it was attached to large spending bills, raising the spending caps by $620 billion over 4 years. And once it was part of a bill that included disaster aid spending. I'd add, even with that spending, the majority of House Democrats still voted against the 2018 debt limit hike. And if we just want to go back a little further, there were 3 clean debt limit hikes under President Bush with a full Republican Congress. And House and Senate Democrats voted against those clean debt limit hikes at a 98.8% rate, including then Senators Obama and Biden. So I think it's fair to conclude that neither party's hands are really clean on debt limit hikes.
To you also, President Biden likes to claim that he's lowered the deficit, a falsehood repeated so often that the Washington Post awarded him what's called a bottomless Pinocchio rating. Critical of fiscal legacies of presidents in both parties. What do you make of President Biden's track record on the budget?
Thank you. I mean, in all my reports, I've done reports scoring presidential records of Democrats and Republicans, and the proper measure is against the baseline the president inherited. Because something like one-time pandemic spending expiring on schedule is not new deficit reduction. When President Biden was elected, CBO forecast deficits of $2.3 trillion and then $1.1 trillion. Instead, we got $2.8 trillion and $1.4, which is $800 billion higher than the baseline. Overall, as you mentioned earlier, when President Biden was inaugurated, CBO forecast $14 trillion in deficits over 10 years, and now they're forecasting $20 trillion in deficits over the same 10-year period. $5 trillion of that increase has come directly from legislation and executive orders, pushing deficits towards $3 trillion. So in that context, I don't think keeping the deficit below a past one-time pandemic spike is really the right measure.
And then also to you, CBO and Joint Committee on Taxation released their scores of the House bill. They revealed that many of the new tax credits in last year's partisan reconciliation bill are actually going to cost much more than initially advertised. Knowing what we know now, was last year's reconciliation bill, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, the fiscally responsible legislation supporters portray it to be?
Well, at the time of enactment, CBO scored the bill as saving $238 billion over the decade, including the IRS revenues. Now, OMB says the same bill is going to add $216 trillion to 10-year deficits. Much of that change is due to the electric vehicle incentives that were originally scored by JCT as 14 trillion and are now estimated by Goldman Sachs and Brookings as costing $390 billion over 10 years. So no, the law at this point does not appear to be a deficit reducer.